Hello everyone and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Open Wheel Show. My name is David, and in this episode I'm going to start a three-part series running down the Formula One 2020 grid, starting with the reigning World Constructors Champions, Mercedes-AMG F1. Now the intention with these episodes, this rundown of the 2020 grid, is not necessarily to provide like an in-depth history of each of these teams or each of these drivers. It's more just to introduce the cast of characters that you're going to have to become familiar with if you're new to Formula One in 2020, or if you've just recently joined off the back of things like Netflix's Drive to Survive series, or all of the great YouTube content that's floating around out there. And again, this is going to be a three-part series, mainly because there are 10 teams on the grid, there's 20 drivers, it's a lot of stuff to get through. So we're going to start off with last year's top three, Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull. Let's get going. Mercedes-AMG F1 was established in 2010 after the Daimler company, the parent company behind Mercedes-Benz and all of that kind of stuff, purchased essentially a controlling interest in Braun Grand Prix, which was a Formula One team that preceded it. Mercedes-AMG F1 has been the World Constructors Champion in each of the last 6 seasons of Formula One, and the team of the World Drivers Champion each of the last 6 seasons as well. Now, the champion of the last 6 seasons hasn't been the same person. There was a little bit of a, I guess you might call it an interregnum, if you wanted to be sort of cheeky about it. But the man in charge of Mercedes-AMG this entire time, ultimately, is team principal Toto Wolff, and he's been there basically since the real success started. Toto Wolff is a former racing driver in his own right. He competed in several various lower tier championships like GT and rally car stuff in Europe before becoming a part owner first in Williams, and then eventually the Mercedes F1 team. For a brief period of time, he was actually the part owner of both Williams and Mercedes at the same time. That wasn't the case for a period of time, but actually just this month, June 2020, Toto Wolff repurchased a small stake in Williams. Now, the important things about Toto Wolff and Mercedes in general is sort of, it's epitomized by this drive for excellence that I think that not a lot of the other teams have, which is strange to say when you're talking about Formula One. Formula One is the pinnacle of motorsport. It is the world championship that basically you strive for if you're a racing driver in the world, more or less. And yet, for a lot of the teams on the grid, I don't feel like excellence above all else is necessarily the motto at play. But it is at Mercedes, and I feel like the driving factor behind that is Toto Wolff, and in the past, Niki Lauda, who was a former Formula One champion, who also had a small ownership interest in the team, but basically served alongside Toto Wolff as a almost co-team principal at some point. Niki Lauda was instrumental in recruiting the first driver that we're going to talk about in this cast of characters. Unfortunately, he passed away recently. You'll see on the livery of Mercedes cars a single red star, and that red star represents Niki Lauda. Now, the first driver that we're going to talk about in this cast of characters is, of course, Lewis Hamilton. He's the reigning World Drivers Champion. He is a 6-time F1 champion. He won one of those championships with McLaren Mercedes back in the day. He's won 5 of them with Mercedes, and he has to be considered the odds-on favorite to win a 7th championship, a 6th one with Mercedes, tying Michael Schumacher's record and basically cementing himself. If he isn't already considered as one of the greatest racing drivers to have ever existed, he certainly would be if he won a 7th championship. There's not a whole lot else to say about Lewis Hamilton, which is, well, I guess that's actually not true. There's a ton more to say about Lewis Hamilton, but almost all of that exists outside of the scope of this quick rundown. Lewis Hamilton is a British racing driver. He's come up through the ranks. Quite famously, he comes from a not as privileged background as a lot of the other drivers on the grid, and quite frankly, he's just one of the best to have ever driven a Formula One car. Moving on to his teammate, his wingman, if you will, is Valtteri Bottas. He's a Finnish driver. He started off really strong in Formula One, and he is still a super solid, super dependable driver for Mercedes. He's capable of winning races. He's capable of being in the mix for podiums pretty consistently. Basically, he never lets the team down. However, he also never really takes that next step of competing for a championship. Now, at the beginning of last year's season, 2019, Bottas came in with sort of a new look and a new vibe. The memes were actually pretty spectacular. They all revolved around essentially Bottas 2.0, as an upgraded version of Bottas. He came in much more focused, and this was actually a reflection of a very sort of minor change in the regulations that essentially allowed him to not have to lose so much weight. The drivers' weights are actually a pretty important concern, or had been historically, in terms of just the simple math. It's physics, right? The less the car weighs, and the car's weight includes the weight of the driver, of course. So functionally, the less that the driver weighs, the faster the car goes. Regulations were changed ahead of the 2019 season, though, and basically that allowed Bottas to focus more on his actual physical health as opposed to just his weight as a number that he needed to achieve. So he came in looking pretty strong. He had a beard, he was focused, he was on it. He won the Australian GP, he was looking very strong in several performances throughout the first half of the season, and then he just kind of faded out. And this is sort of a pattern of sorts that has been observed about Bottas over the years. The real question right now about Bottas is, well, I guess there's a couple questions. So the first question is, are we in store for a 3.0? Are we looking for an upgrade this year? Is he going to come in with another sick radio message?
To whom it may concern, you.
Or are we just looking at more of a wingman for life scenario? Like, is he just going to settle into a number 2 position here? The reason why this becomes more important is the fact that Bottas's contract expires at the end of this year. Now, silly season is already in full effect. We'll talk about that here in a minute with Ferrari and Sebastian Vettel's situation. However, a lot of stuff still has to happen. There's a lot of drivers who don't have new contracts yet, including Lewis Hamilton, in fact. The reason why more focus isn't put on Lewis Hamilton's contract, though, is the simple fact that if he wants to keep driving, he'll keep driving. He's one of the greats. He can get a contract with any team that he wants, basically. Bottas, on the other hand, is not one of the greats, unfortunately. He's certainly a race winner. He's capable of delivering podiums. Like I said, he's very dependable. But that doesn't necessarily get you a drive these days. So the big question, the fundamental question, is where is Bottas going in 2021? Is he going to stay with Mercedes? Is Hamilton going to retire at the end of the year after he wins his 7th championship? Or is he going to stick around and keep going for more, look to break the record of Michael Schumacher? Is Bottas basically sick and tired of one-year contracts? Is he going to look for more stability? There's openings at Renault. There's potential openings in other organizations where he would probably be appreciated. He doesn't have the star power that some of those organizations are looking for, but he is a consistent, reliable driver. He's been at the top tier team, not a top tier, the top tier team of Formula One for years now. So he can, to a certain extent, determine his own future. It's just up to him, and it's a big question mark. So it's something that I'm looking forward to finding out more about, hopefully in the near future. Where does Bottas land? Can Bottas challenge Hamilton for a championship the way that Nico Rosberg did in 2016? There's a lot of questions that remain outstanding about Bottas. I'm a personal fan of Bottas. I like both the Finnish drivers on the grid, Bottas and Kimi Räikkönen. I think he is underrated to a certain extent by a lot of people, and I think he is totally capable of winning a championship in a car like a Mercedes right now. That being said, we're going to move on to Scuderia Ferrari. Now, Ferrari, you know what Ferrari is. Like, if you are a human being who has seen cars in your life, you know what Ferrari is. But Scuderia Ferrari, in particular, is the most famous racing team on the planet. I say that without reservation. It's also the oldest surviving team on the grid, having taken part in every single F1 championship campaign since 1950. The team principal at Ferrari, starting last year, is Mattia Binotto. He became the team principal last year following the departure of Maurizio Arrivabene. Prior to that, he served as Ferrari's technical director, and he's been with the company since like the 90s as an engineer in various forms, primarily working on the engines. His rise to power in Ferrari, and I use that phrase very specifically because Ferrari, for those that are maybe a little bit less informed or are new to the series, Ferrari is a team that has a very high pedigree. They have a very high standard of excellence, and they have a very, very high level of political infighting in that team. Binotto's rise is as the result of a whole lot of backstory. Once again, it's sort of a Lewis Hamilton situation where we could get into it now, but we should probably save that for like its whole episode. But it all ties into the first Ferrari driver that we're going to talk about here, which is Charles Leclerc. Charles Leclerc is a youngster. He's one of the new faces of F1. He's very exciting. He's incredibly talented, and he is a potential world champion in the making if Ferrari can deliver him a car capable of it. That's a big question. We're going to get back to that in a second. Charles Leclerc is a Formula 2 champion. In 2018, he made his debut in Formula 1 with Alfa Romeo. In 2019, he moved to Ferrari and performed to such a level that now, in 2020, Ferrari and Sebastian Vettel have announced that Sebastian Vettel is going to be leaving Ferrari. Leclerc is the future. He's on a long-term deal with Ferrari. He's not going to go anywhere else anytime soon. He's not only the face of a franchise, and also it's worth noting here, the face of Giorgio Armani, but he is also a very talented racing driver, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do with the Ferrari this year. Moving on, his teammate for the second year running, but for the last year, is Sebastian Vettel. Sebastian Vettel is one of the veterans on the field. He is a 4-time world champion. However, he won all those world championships with Red Bull Racing, which is the final team that we're going to cover in this episode. He came to Ferrari and there was a lot of expectations. If you weren't familiar with Formula One back then, or if you're just coming to the series now, it's sort of hard to really express adequately the hype around Sebastian Vettel at the time that he signed his Ferrari contract. He was coming off of 4 back-to-back four-peat world championships with Red Bull. He was an exciting, young German driver going to the most famous Italian racing team to have ever existed, who in recent memory had dominated the sport with an exciting German driver named Michael Schumacher. So there were certainly a lot of parallels that people were drawing. Unfortunately, Vettel showed up at Ferrari, and Ferrari failed to deliver to him a car really capable of competing for championships, with the possible exception of in 2018 and 2019. Basically, the dream never came true. The dream was that Sebastian Vettel would move to Ferrari and replicate his hero, Michael Schumacher's exploits there and win a world championship for Ferrari. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. The last Ferrari world champion is a guy named Kimi Räikkönen, who won it in 2007, is actually still on the grid today. Just not anywhere that you would notice, according to most F1 broadcasts. 2020 is the last season that Sebastian Vettel is going to drive for Ferrari. It's kind of a shame because he doesn't look to have a drive in 2021. It's not to say that he's out of the sport forever. A lot of drivers actually end up taking a break at some point in their career, and it's entirely possible that we see Vettel driving again, and I personally hope that we do. Vettel's an interesting character on the grid because he doesn't have a social media presence. He refuses to engage in social media. He keeps a very private, low-profile kind of life, and I respect that quite a lot out of today's grid. He's also a genuine fan of the sport. In any interview that you watch with Vettel, it becomes quickly apparent that he cares about racing. Racing is in his blood. He wants to do more racing even when he's not driving. He has stated previously that he would love to go back and be an engineer or maybe even a team principal. So we're not done with Vettel in Formula One, certainly under any circumstance. I certainly hope that we get to see him drive again, but I'll also be happy if in 5 years Vettel is the team principal of, Mercedes. Just a crazy idea. Finally, the last team that we're going to cover is Red Bull Racing. Now, again, if you're new to Formula One, the idea that an energy drink company is going to own and operate a Formula One team might seem a little weird, and it kind of is. However, it's pretty much in line with their branding, which is very extreme sports focused, and Formula One is the extremist of motorsports. So it sort of all lines up. Also, Red Bull has a pretty long history in Formula One, dating before their creation of Red Bull Racing. They were a primary sponsor for Sauber F1 team, which still exists on the grid in the form of Alfa Romeo, back in the 90s. The current Red Bull team, though, started life as Stewart Grand Prix, as in Jackie Stewart, the former world champion, way back in 1997. Stewart Grand Prix only lasted a couple years. It ended up being sold to Ford, who branded it as Jaguar Racing. Jaguar Racing only existed for a few years, didn't have a whole lot of success, and before the 2005 season was purchased by Red Bull. The team principal there is Christian Horner. He has been the team principal since the very beginning. He's known to be a bit of a drama starter in the paddock. He definitely takes little digs. He's a great character in terms of a cast of characters on the grid. Like Toto Wolff over at Mercedes, Christian Horner is actually a former racing driver. Arguably, he's even achieved a little bit more success than Toto Wolff in terms of being a driver. He actually raced in Formula 3000, which is the ancestor to today's Formula 2. Before moving into team management, he was actually the founder of the Arden Formula 2 team. And driving for Horner are a couple of guys that are pretty hard to not like right now. I'll start with the more lovable of the two, which is absolutely going to be Alexander Albon. I absolutely love Albon. I think he seems like a sweetheart. He is a genuinely nice guy from all accounts. He's a fantastic racing driver. He finished third in Formula 2 in 2018 behind Lando Norris and George Russell, who are a couple of other drivers currently on the Formula 1 grid that we'll talk about in other episodes. And his story is pretty remarkable because he started, before the 2019 season, Alexander Albon didn't even have a seat in Formula 1. He was actually slated to join Nissan's Formula E team, but sort of at the last second, as a result of a bunch of dominoes falling, which we'll talk about later, he took over a post that became available at Scuderia Toro Rosso, which is the Red Bull Racing B team, more or less, at Formula 1. And again, we'll talk more about that in another episode. Halfway through last year's season in 2019, he ended up getting promoted from Toro Rosso into the Red Bull Racing team proper, taking over the post from Pierre Gasly, who was seen to be underperforming and did pretty well. He didn't capture any podiums, which was one of the main criticisms levied at Pierre Gasly in his time at Red Bull, but he also didn't perform quite as poorly as Gasly either. He picked up solid points where they were available, and to be fair to Albon, he was actually robbed of his first podium at Brazil last year by Lewis Hamilton, who sort of accidentally crashed into him. That brings us to our sixth and final driver for this episode, which is Max Verstappen. Like Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen is one of the young faces of Formula One. He is a franchise sort of figure in the paddock, and he is almost certainly going to, at some point, be a champion. In my mind, the only real question is he going to be a champion at Red Bull? There's been a lot of rumors over the last few years of talks with Mercedes, and I think that when Lewis Hamilton departs Mercedes, along their publicly stated list of basically backup drivers that they have currently racing on the grid, which includes Esteban Ocon, George Russell, they've even floated Sebastian Vettel as a potential replacement. I actually think my personal pet theory is that Max Verstappen is pretty high up on that list and probably has a pre-contract in place with Mercedes already. That being said, it's entirely possible that he could win a championship with Red Bull, and it could actually happen this year in 2020. Because of the truncated schedule due to the global pandemic, it is entirely possible that Max could pull out a couple of stunning upset wins at places where Red Bull doesn't usually go very well, and coupling that with places where Red Bull does usually go well, he's definitely got a chance at the championship. He's not the favorite by any means, but he is an aggressive, in a good way, driver. He's an exciting driver. He definitely can do some overtakes. He's quick and he's hungry for it. He's actually the youngest race winner in Formula One's history. He won a race at the ripe old age of 18 years old, which is a feat that's not likely to be ever broken because there's actually age limits now. For the last few years, Max Verstappen's actually been sort of a perennial almost contender. The main fights have always been between Mercedes and Ferrari in recent years, but Max Verstappen, sort of almost apart from Red Bull or carrying Red Bull on his shoulders, has made an argument for himself in the standings, certainly. He's won races, he's been competitive, even when the car hasn't been there for him. And that about wraps it up, honestly. That's the top 3 teams. These are the drivers that are most likely to win the championship this year in 2020. And by most likely, I mean almost assuredly. Almost no other team is going to really challenge for a championship this year. There's a lot of reasons for that, and it's not always going to be true because there is going to be a regulations change in 2022. But for the time being, these are our main cast of characters. Pretty much everyone else on the grid is going to be a supporting character until we find out what's happening with the Mercedes seats. Stay tuned for the next episode in this series. We're going to be covering basically the midfield. If you've enjoyed the episode and if you stuck around this long, I really appreciate it, first off. Second off, definitely hit me up with some feedback. You can email podcast@theopenwheel.show. That's theopenwheel.show. Or you can just go to theopenwheel.show on the internet or theopenwheelshow.com if you're like old fashioned. And drop me a line. Let me know what you think of the show. Let me know what I should cover in the future. Right now, there's going to be a 3-part series, 2 more parts running down the rest of the Formula One grid. I also have in the books a IndyCar basically race recap for the first actual open wheel racing that we've received this year so far, which I'm very excited about, even if the race was kind of a dud. And hopefully a couple of previews of Formula 2, Formula 3, and some other open wheel series like Super Formula over in Japan. For the time being though, stick around, subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend if you liked it, leave a review if you really liked it. If you hated it, it's cool, man. Not everything's for everyone. Thanks for listening. Catch you on the next time.